just so you know. So to advance the slide, do I tell you or do I? I'll signal. Okay. So that's my signal. I'll begin with a poem by Langston Hughes about the popularity of the Harlem Renaissance and its relationship with more mainstream commercial theater in the 1930s. You've taken my blues and gone. You sing them on Broadway, and you sing them in the Hollywood Bowl, and you mix them up with symphonies, and you fixed them so they don't sound like me. Yep, you done taken my blues and gone. You also took my spirituals and gone. You put me in MacBeth, and Carmen Jones, and all kinds of swing Mikados, and everything but what's about me. But someday, somebody will stand up and talk about me, and write about me, black, beautiful, and sing about me, and put on plays about me. I reckon it'll be me, myself. Yes, it'll be me. Now, Hughes, this is written, actually the poem was written in 1939, published in 1940. It's a note on commercial theater. And in this poem, Hughes specifically mentions MacBeth as something that the blues have been mixed up with. And it is clear that he is referencing the popularity of the 1936 Federal Theater Project production of MacBeth. Orson Welles directed the influential all-black adaptation of MacBeth for the Negro Theater Unit of the Works Progress Administration in 1936, in which the play's setting was famously transposed to 19th century Caribbean, deliberately evoking historical resonances between MacBeth and the Haitian Emperor Henri Christophe. Shakespeare's MacBeth captures an English fascination with Scotland, perceived in early modern England as a frightening land of the uncivilized. And Welles's adaptation transposed this fascination into a post-colonial context by moving the play to Henri Christophe's 19th century court, transforming the witches into voodoo priestesses and Hecate as their male witch doctor. And this is an image of the witches at the end with MacBeth's head, and then the next image is of Hecate. The production was popular, as Carl Van Vechten explains to Langston Hughes after seeing it for the third time. Again crowds, again cheers, again all sorts of excitement. I found out at last what Harlem really likes. Have you ever heard of any other playwright who could create standing room at every performance at the Lafayette for 5 weeks? Promotional material from the Federal Theater boasts that over 150,000 people saw the play in its New York run alone, with reports that over 10,000 showed up for the premiere. And this photo has become, now iconic, and I'll return to it in a little bit. But you can see that, we've got large crowds showing up. And this is I've never, until just this week when I was putting together the slideshow, I had not seen this image before, but it's of the audience inside, and I love how beautiful they look, right? This was an event. You're going to Shakespeare, and you're dressing up, so I love this. MacBeth provided work and wages for a large segment of the Black theatrical community and helped promote African American actors like Edna Thomas, Jack Carter, and Morris Ellis. This is a picture that you can see the kind of largesse of the set. There were 150 actors employed, but there were also stage managers, there were scene designers, artists who were employed on this production. And you can get a sense of how big it was from these images. The production also showcased new performers, including a group of drummers from Sierra Leone who stole the show as witches, receiving critical praise both in New York and on the road tour. And it is a populist legacy that is often celebrated by actors who worked with Welles. And I don't know if any of you have seen this. It's a 4-minute video clip from a documentary put out by the Works Progress Administration called We Work Again. It was put out in 1937. So if you actually put the cursor onto the image, and this is where the audio is, if it doesn't, oops. If you click there, it should come up. If not, it's okay.
We're going to give it a minute.
It's available online if it doesn't work here, but it's a great kind of startling representation of different acting styles from the early 20th century to now. It's definitely more declamatory and kind of bombastic, but it's so beautiful that we have this 4-minute clip of the production. It's the last 4 minutes of the show, but it doesn't look like it's going to work, so that's all right. We'll go to the next slide. Okay. As Marguerite Rippey argues in Weyward, Macbeth, numerous fascinating anecdotes surround the production, many of which remain unverifiable and impossible to separate from Welles's unusual talent as a provocateur. Most notoriously, Welles claimed after the fact to have once filled in for the ailing lead actor Jack Carter when the show was on tour in Indianapolis. Years later, Welles recounted with pride how he performed the role so convincingly in blackface that no one noticed that it was a white actor, much less Orson Welles, performing as Macbeth. Such an anecdote is, by necessity, deviously unverifiable, for it turns on the supposed fluency of Welles's performative passing. If anyone had actually recognized Welles, and no reviewers have done so in print, his blackness would not have been a success. Stories such as these capture the mix of clever self-promotion and audacity that would come to characterize the career of the then 21-year-old Orson Welles. But they also begin to convey a more troubling blend of racially progressive politics on the one hand and racially insensitive opportunism on Welles's part on the other that are quite characteristic of this production of Macbeth as a whole. In fact, the concept of the Negro Theater Unit within the Federal Theater Project was controversial for African Americans at the time. The appointment of John Houseman to lead the unit made it vulnerable to charges of racism from the outset, and the production has been criticized in retrospect for reenacting white colonial fantasies of race. Houseman famously said, quote, "Anyone who has ever done Macbeth knows the witches are a terrible problem. Nobody ever believes them. You cast them with some emaciated old ladies, or fat old ladies, or fat old gentlemen, and they trot around the stage. When Macbeth arrives and is persuaded by these hags, nobody believes it for a minute. However, if you put the whole thing in Haiti, that is in the home of voodoo, the witches can become voodoo priestesses." And I want to end the, obviously at the end of his quote should be, voila. Right? In Houseman's own rhetoric then, Haiti is less a real place than a promised fantasy of exoticism. Next quote. Thinking back on the production in 1942, Orson Welles offered what can only be considered a backhanded compliment for the black actors in Macbeth. And I think the quote I'm going to read you is slightly longer than, I've already broken all the rules of PowerPoint slides. It's too small, it's too word, I know. I know the limitations. Okay, so just listen. The Negro with his virgin mind, picture my virgin mind in your mind, pure without any special intellectual intoxication, understands the essence of the Greek theater better, which demands simplicity and the absence of artificial interpretations. I staged Macbeth by Shakespeare in Harlem, New York, by a cast of Negroes, and never had I the trouble to read or to correct speech and intonations. They discovered all themselves with a prodigious intuition that they have in a high degree for the tragic theater, and this in the face of their never having read or heard speak of Shakespeare before. Of course, this represents another white fantasy, that of the, and not all of you whites have this fantasy. Disclaimers. This represents another fantasy for some whites, how about that? That of the pure and intuitive black. But of course, many of the actors in Welles's production were trained actors who had previous experience performing Shakespeare, which is a far cry from his claim that the cast had never even heard of Shakespeare before. Yet, it is fair to ask, why Macbeth? What is wayward about the intersections of race and performance in Macbeth that drew both Houseman and Wells to the idea of staging a production with an all-black cast? Oh, next slide. The collection Weyward Macbeth grew out of a 2008 symposium that was organized by Scott Newstock, who Colette mentioned in her introduction. And he organized the symposium at Rhodes College when he noticed the coincidence of the Hattie Lou Theater Company staging Shakespeare's Macbeth with a predominantly black cast, in conjunction with Opera Memphis's staging of Verdi's Macbeth with black principals. So it was this coincidence that he said, we should probably do something on, Macbeth and race, and he invited a bunch of us. So this really came out of nowhere. So perhaps thinking about Macbeth and race together might seem like a fluke, since these companies could have staged several other play-opera combinations. Yet there remains something unique about Macbeth, the haunted play, the play that shall not be named, in which nothing is but what is not. Whether or not its very essence is unique, people have historically treated Macbeth as anomalous, different, and other, as wayward, in fact. At its very core, the Scottish play is about the very real distinctions between a king and one who dons borrowed robes, the English and the Scottish, the physical and the metaphysical. So should we be surprised that Macbeth is not the antithesis of a race play, that is, not an unraced, non-raced, or normatively raced play? You see how the English language struggles to get the sense that there's something that cannot have race, right? After all, the wayward qualities of the witches seem to stem in part from their Scottishness, a sort of 17th century joke about King James's ethnicity. And it is these wayward sisters who most clearly verbalize how racially inflected the play is in their famous, and I'd say infamously censored, incantation. Bits of this will sound familiar and then maybe less familiar, but yet it's all there. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble, that's familiar, right? Liver of blaspheming Jew, gall of goat and slips of yew, slivered in the moon's eclipse, nose of Tartar, nose of Turk and Tartar's lips. However, it's not simply the witch's brew with the bits of Jew, Turk, and Tartar, nor even the play's consistent recourse to early modern figurative invocations of whiteness and blackness that makes Macbeth read as much more racially engaged than is conventionally assumed. The play traffics in racialized discourse. The convergence on Memphis's non-traditionally cast productions of Macbeth, then, was not as singular as it might at first appear. While Macbeth may not fit neatly into the category of a race play, like a specter, it nevertheless is haunted by and haunts the rhetoric and performances of race. Unlike the overdetermined role of fellow plays in historical and contemporary constructions of racial differences, especially about blackness, Macbeth often lures actors, directors, writers, and others into thinking that the Scottish play does not carry what Harry Lennox refers to in the collection as the onerous burden of race. This lure is so powerful, as the totality of Weyward Macbeth demonstrates, that actors, directors, and writers often assume that they are the first to see the connections. This, of course, is not the case with the Georgia Shakes production, because Raelle is so brilliant, right? I mean, she's done all the research, so she knows that she's approaching this in footsteps that many others have approached before, and she's made incredibly unique and interesting decisions. Yet, quite to the contrary, Macbeth has played a role in American constructions of race from its appearance as the first Shakespearean play documented in the American colonies in 1699, owned by the Virginia lawyer and plantation owner, Captain Arthur Spicer, to the proposed Hollywood film with an all-black cast. Now, this film has been in production forever, or pre-production forever, so I don't know if it'll ever come out, but it's set to star Terrence Howard, Sanaa Lathan, Harry Lennox, Blair Underwood, and Danny Glover, if it ever gets made. Let's hope it does. But in the 19th century, MacBeth provided the context for the Black actor Ira Aldridge's experimentation with whiteface performance. Aldridge, and I hope you can see that image because it's so great. Aldridge, as some of you may know, was an American-born actor who got his start in the African theater in New York, but who achieved stardom in Eastern Europe. I mean, he became quite famous in Poland and in Russia. And in fact, I vowed if I ever get an endowed chair, plug, any of you want to give me money, that I would call it the Ira Aldridge Shakespeare Chair, because here's someone, an unsung hero, who was quite famous away from his homeland. As Bernd Linders shows in his essay, the first record of Aldridge playing Macbeth dates to 1830 in Paisley, Scotland, which is quite ironic. Likewise, other 19th century Black actors were including monologues and scenes from Macbeth in their performances. Morgan Smith, and this image I stole from online. It's actually for sale on an auction site. It's a signature, an original signature of his with a little engraved image. Morgan Smith played monologues from Macbeth from 1866 to 1869 when he toured the United Kingdom. And Henrietta Vinton Davis staged scenes from Macbeth in her 1884 performance at the Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. Of course, that's the famous theater in which Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Starting in the early 20th century, historically Black colleges and universities began putting on productions of Macbeth, including, I think, what we believe is the first documented one in an HBCU, the 1913 Lincoln University Stagecrafters production. And although Orson Welles' 1936 version of Macbeth is often discussed as the creation of Welles' singular and immense creative genius, there was an all-Black FTP production the year before in Boston. As Lisa Simmons documents in her essay, Ralph Coleman directed an all-Black Macbeth in the fall of 1935. On September 22nd, the New York Times reported that Coleman's, quote, Negro Shakespeare troupe, which had been ordered to the Saugus, Massachusetts town hall by the Emergency Relief Administration, hurried through Macbeth in record-breaking time and was wildly cheered when it returned after a breathtaking ride from Saugus, doffed Shakespearean costumes, and donned waterfront motley to perform Stevedore, a Negro waterfront strike play. End quote. Coleman's Macbeth was subsequently performed on October 18th at a high school in Roxbury, and the program from that performance indicates that Lucien Ayres played Macbeth, Lou O'Neill, Mason, Banquo, Frank Silvera, Malcolm, Lorenzo Quarles, who is in this photograph with Ralph Coleman as Donalbain, and Ruth Johnson as Lady Macbeth. As the Boston Chronicle reported on October 19th, 1935, quote, Shakespeare's Macbeth was presented by an all-Negro cast last evening. Negro members of the Boston Civic Theater appeared in the tragedy under the direction of Ralph Coleman. A musical program was provided by an all-Negro orchestra under the direction of Theodore Bailey. The entertainment was given in cooperation with the Boston School Centers as part of a program of extended use of public schools. I mean, I love this kind of WPA era thinking, right? That schools, these great public buildings, should be used at night as well for the public, and here they are, right? Sponsorship was by the emergency, this is still the quote in the Boston Chronicle. Sponsorship was by the Emergency Relief Administration with local sponsorship by the Roxbury Joint Planning Committee of the Citywide Emergency Committee. So here's an emergency, right? Get your community together to enjoy some arts. The Boston Macbeth emerged during the interesting early stages of the transition from the Emergency Relief Administration to the Federal Theater Project, as Congress finally approved funding for the FTP in October of 1935. From the records that Lisa Simmons has reviewed, it appears that this presentation of Macbeth was staged largely as Shakespeare wrote it, with the all-Negro cast playing all of the characters. It was not set in any exoticized Black locale. It was simply meant to be Scotland. And unlike Wells's later voodoo Macbeth, Colman reproduced Macbeth in its original version because he strongly believed in presenting the talent and range of his black actors. Lisa Simmons speculates whether Wells somehow caught wind of Colman's production. Wells always maintained that his wife, Virginia, came up with the idea for performing Macbeth as the first play for the New York Negro Theater Unit. But Simmons speculates what perhaps Wells might have been partially inspired by this 1935 version in Boston, directed by a black director. And if so, would this prove an important complication to the Wells legend of this, unique and individual genius? Colman's silent ghost of a production would thus push Wells's Macbeth from its stool. Likewise, there have been numerous contemporary theater companies that assume that they are unique in attempting to restage Wells's voodoo version. Moreover, there have been African American, Asian American, Native American, both Alaskan and Hawaiian, and Latino theater companies that turn to Macbeth to help stage their own unique racial, ethnic, and cultural identities. As Scott Newstock argues in Weyward Macbeth, it should come as no surprise that the black theater companies that have attempted to engage with Wells's precedent find themselves contorted into sometimes contradictory positions of drawing upon the familiarity with the 1936 production while also attempting to distinguish themselves from it. In fact, the very first non-Wells revival in 1937 in Los Angeles bizarrely captures the very paradoxes such an endeavor must entail. The FTP had initially intended for their productions to be portable, right? So if you've got a whole design for Macbeth in New York, you get to employ all those actors and designers and artists in New York, but then the concept can move to another city so that then you can employ more artists, more actors, et cetera, in that other city instead of transposing all the actors from one locale to another. It was just the idea that was supposed to move. Max Pollack in Los Angeles was set to receive the New York production ideas and restage them in Los Angeles. But Pollack said that there was a transmission that went awry. Quote, "Although we were under the impression that we were to receive from New York Mr. Orson Welles' original script, it was not forthcoming for some unknown reason. We decided to make our own treatment. When we were through with our own script, we received the New York text. We, of course, preferred our own, with one exception. We used Mr. Welles' character of Hecate as he did. While this deprived us of complete originality, we felt that Mr. Welles' treatment of the witchcraft in Macbeth was so well suited to the Negro conception of Macbeth. And since we had to pay a royalty to Mr. Welles in any event, and time for production was pressing, we permitted his characterization to remain in our production. Had we had sufficient time, we would have deleted that too, in order to call the production completely our own." End quote. I love these old quotes, right? I mean, they get exactly at the heart of the matter. While the LA production did hire Tommy Anderson, who was the stage manager for the New York unit, Pollack and his crew seemed to resist the very notion that they ought to be obliged to reproduce Welles's vision at all for the sake of their own artistic autonomy. Yet, for financial and Scott Newstock suspects symbolic reasons, they decided to include something from the belated script. Yet the notes on the playbill allied most of their autonomy, making them appear to hew far more closely to the New York unit than in fact they did. And I know that this is going to be too small for you to read, but I will do a dramatic reading of it for you. "Passion, savage lust for power, and the murderous fury of King Macbeth in an African kingdom. Jungle drums and rhythms, voodoo rites. This is Shakespeare's great play in dynamic, innovative splendor. The cast of 75 people is directed by Max Pollack in an adaptation based on the history-making New York Harlem production by Orson Welles." End quote. Based on seems something of a stretch if that merely entailed the modification of Hecate's role, but this kind of tribute to the inordinate authority of Welles's production had already been attained, and 1 year later, in 1937. The new Federal Theater, which was formed in 1970 by Woody King Jr., made a singular exception to its decades-long mission of, quote, presenting plays by minorities and women, to mount Macbeth in 1977 in a production self-consciously conceived as a revival, with the apparent rediscovery of Wells's prompt book in 1974. Given that King was among the vehement opponents of Joseph Papp's plan shortly thereafter for a Black and Hispanic Shakespeare repertory company, and here's a quote from King about this. He says, quote, putting on, so this is not the quote, putting on Shakespeare by a Black and Latino company is like, quote, putting a plantation overseer in charge of Black theater. Papp's company is a perpetuation of the white power structure in America, a white concept in blackface, end quote. So given his feelings about that theater company, how could King countenance the problematic precedent of Wells? Contrary to what one might expect, King seems to have sought out Wells, going so far as inviting him via his lawyer to join the production. While Wells did not join the New Federal in New York, he did grant King, quote, special permission to mount the play, which King took care to note in interviews and promotional materials. Barring Wells's actual presence, King used every other available means to establish and authenticate continuities between the version he was producing and Wells's original. Newspaper advertisements sold the play as, quote, Shakespeare's Macbeth, adapted by Orson Welles. And the director, Edmund Cambridge, was announced as having been involved in the original show as an apprentice, and Thomas Anderson, assistant director, and Leonard DeParr, musical director of the original, were brought in as consultants. And artist Romare Bearden, and you can see this beautiful poster here, which I think is just amazing, and Perry Watkins, who was John Houseman's assistant, were also brought in for talkbacks. So you see that like King is really working hard to like say, we're doing it right. We've got the imprimatur of Wells here. Even though in his normal kind of theatrical, political life, this would have been anathema to him. But perhaps by insisting so much on the proximity to Wells, the places where the production felt distant from its source were further accentuated. As Bernice Kleinman notes, quote, casting a woman as Hecate, and it was Louisa Stubbs, instead of a man as in 1936, visually diminished the mass of this figure, though with high cork shoes and a full white afro hairstyle, she compensated credibly. The orchestra and the chorus were gone from the original, and along with them most of the special music, diminishing the power found in the original, end quote. In fact, production notes in the Lex Monson collection at the Schomburg Center reveal deeper tensions. Most telling, Scott Newstock argues, and perhaps an apt subtitle to the entire collection of Weyward Macbeth, is a handwritten note that reads, quote, nota bene, disturbs me, and then it says, Scotland plus voodoo drums equals, I find this incongruous. Isn't that I mean, this is a note, right, in the production materials, and yet in all of the advertisements, Wells is there at the forefront. Scott Newstock argues that the voodoo Macbeth places one in a color bind. If you decide to perform Macbeth with an all-black cast, you're already following in grooves Wells etched long ago, which can at times feel like ruts. If, on the other hand, you attempt to reconstruct the 1936 production, you run up against impossible standards of fidelity, all too familiar for anyone adapting Shakespeare, but further exacerbated by the detailed yet diffuse and often contradictory archive of what the Wells production was really like. If, on the other hand, you deny the production's influence when it clearly has established a precedent, you're liable to become irritated by its gravitational force, right? If you're a Black director directing Macbeth, you are going to be asked about Wells, whether or not you know anything about it. That's the gravitational force of this production. And a good example is the Classical Theater of Harlem. Scott Newstock senses this to be the case with Alfred Preisser, who co-founded is it Preisser? I don't know him. Does anyone know his name? I'll say Preisser. Who co-founded the Classical Theater of Harlem in 1999, which inaugurated its first season with Macbeth, and has since remounted the play more often than any other. In fact, 5 out of its first 10 seasons have included a production of Macbeth. Preisser stated in his correspondence with Scott Newstock that while he was familiar with Wells's Macbeth, his, quote, production was not influenced by that interpretation. I've never really thought about my position as a director in relationship to Wells. Yet Preisser admits some frustration in the reception of his all-black Macbeth. Quote, because of the music and dance, many people perceive the production as a voodoo Macbeth. This says more about many people's continued limited perceptions when they see African Americans on stage than it does about this particular production. In all our dramaturgy, we never discussed the West Indies. We never touched voodoo. People, including critics, would sometimes identify the costumes as African, and you can sort of see the costumes here. They do not look African. I mean, they look kind of, well, I guess you can't sort of fade it in this image, but they look pretty Celtic to me. But in the reviews, they would identify the costumes as African, I think because black people were wearing them, not because of what the costume actually was, end quote. Macbeth's lore that it does not come with the onerous burden of race comes at a price, however. Despite the fact that many of the non-traditionally cast productions bill themselves as unique translations, the first to change Scotland to the Caribbean, Africa, the Alaskan tundra, multiracial post-apocalyptic future, etc., they can only do so by employing a type of historical amnesia. Unlike Othello, The Tempest, or the other supposed race plays, Macbeth does not readily announce itself as already waywardly racialized. The writers, directors, performers, and scholars of wayward Macbeths are thus enabled in forgetting or never knowing the play's long history of literary and performance intersections with race. So I want to return then to Langston Hughes's poetic reflections on the commercial theater's approach to race. When Hughes penned Note on Commercial Theater in 1939, he was protesting the absence of black narratives in American popular culture. As he saw it, white producers, artists, performers were appropriating black cultural production, like the blues and spirituals, while putting them in the Hollywood Bowl, in symphonies, in musicals, and on Broadway. The problem with this cultural theft, Hughes intones, is that these appropriations white out the narratives, struggles, and triumphs of the black and the beautiful. Even though these stolen spirituals are promoted as expansive, they nevertheless include everything but what's about me. Coupled with this socio-artistic larceny, Hughes warns, comes the denial of the specificity and uniqueness of racially informed cultural production. Therefore, Hughes places Macbeth in the center of his lament, precisely because he identifies the recently produced Voodoo production in 1936 as a forced marriage in which the black actors must mute their racial identities in order to fit into the dominantly restricted Shakespearean narrative. Looking back at the Wells-directed Voodoo Macbeth with over 70 years of hindsight, however, I find Hughes's poem both prescient and limited. It is prescient in the way he locates the tensions of being put into Macbeth, Carmen Jones, and all kinds of swing liccatos. The forced nature of these translations, revisions, and adaptations is never as seamless and invisible, neither as logically coherent nor stable as the creative team's desire and envision. Disruptive junctions inevitably become highly visible precisely because Shakespeare was not writing about modern American racialized environment. He knew nothing. He knew about witches, but not about voodoo. Yet Hughes's view is also limited in the way he envisions the cultural legacy of Wells's FTP production. The force of Hughes's employment of the verb put, right, you put me in, you put me in, imagines that the black presence in the Voodoo Macbeth has less cultural resonance than the Shakespearean text itself. Yet it is not in fact Macbeth that is remembered as the iconic image that graces the cover of Weyward Macbeth demonstrates. The word Macbeth may be central in this image, but it is the dynamic presence of Black Harlem in the 1930s that draws one in. Likewise, it is the fantasy of Black primitive culture that the voodoo Macbeth constructs that subsumes the play, right? People talk over and over again about the drums. They don't talk about, why Macbeth ends up there, right? The largesse of the cast is discussed. The largesse of the, kind of beneficence of this production is discussed, not Shakespeare. While Hughes is correct in thinking that he must and will play a crucial role in creating the stories, songs, and poems about a beautiful, Black and beautiful me, many other Black and beautiful, Asian and beautiful, Latino and beautiful, and Native American and beautiful artists have seen themselves in Macbeth precisely because it is wayward. That is, weird, fated, fateful, perverse, intractable, willful, erratic, unlicensed, fugitive, troublesome, and wayward itself. This is not to suggest that these visions are uncomplicated, right? That the translations are not somewhat forced, the put again. But the fact that these visions so often occur within the framework of Macbeth is remarkable and necessarily changes one's notion of what it is to be about me. It is fitting that the collection ends with an epilogue about what was then the current socio-political moment, the election of Barack Hussein Obama, but I think hopefully the re-election. While several of the essays allude to the era of Obama and what that might mean for the future of racial politics and performances, several others emphasize the importance of renewed federal funding for the arts. After all, we could not have the legacy of Wells's Voodoo Macbeth without the federally funded Federal Theater Project of the 1930s. Yet, as Richard Burt makes clear in the epilogue to the book, there is a distinct irony in the way Macbeth is recalled in these statements in both the popular and academic media. The historical amnesia that I've described is evident in the way that the Voodoo Macbeth is revisioned as solely progressive. Its complications, its wayward qualities are forgotten and whitewashed in favor of simplistic imaginings of Shakespeare's universal applicability. We actually got permission from Shepard Fairey to use this image. Yeah. So it's legit. Thus, the epilogue to the collection returns to the wayward nature of historical transmission. As we hope to convey through the creation of our Obamacon, Shakespearecon image, progressive change never comes about through simplistic transferences, applications, or substitutions. Putting Shakespeare in Shepard Fairey's iconic Obama change poster does not make him radical, nor does it make casting Macbeth with non-traditional actors a play that is radical. The very wayward qualities and all their myriad complexities of playtext, performance history, scholarship, etc., must be brought into focus so that our desires for progressive acts are not disabled before they even begin, right? I mean, we can shoot ourselves in the foot by claiming that Shakespeare's universal, right? Because, then there's nothing for us to do. You put a Black actor on stage and progress. It may be for that one actor, but it may not be for the country, and it may not be for the race either. Thus, the book includes some 24 essays addressing everything from Frederick Douglass's allusions to the play, to hip-hop adaptations on YouTube, to Duke Ellington's revisionary musical rendition, to multiracial prison productions, so that we might learn what it means to remember one facet of our cultural legacy. A conscious remembering, revisioning, and restaging is the true first step to change and progress. Thank you. I hope that wasn't too word heavy. Sometimes, you write